Welcome to the target stream for MINTPRESS News. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. As always, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Yemen's armed forces are launching relentless attacks on Saudi proxies and Saudi Arabia's own oil facilities as mysterious drone attacks continue to target Libya's largest oil refinery and other targets. Iran is playing a strategic game to squeeze the United States as U.S. sailors are now apparently, according to reports, so depressed at fighting a war for Israel that some are reportedly threatening to throw themselves off of an aircraft carrier. There's a lot more as well that we will be looking into today, a lot of important and interesting developments about what is happening across the region. And before we get to that, the target stream is 100% viewer funded. In the last 2 years, we were financially targeted and banned by PayPal, and our fundraisers were taken down by Indiegogo and GoFundMe. They even withheld our funds. So we are looking for 300 new members to make sure we can keep this new show alive. You can join MINTPRESS on Patreon or right here on YouTube and join our membership program. With that being said, there are a number of developments that have occurred which are rather interesting across the region, which we're going to explore in a little bit of depth today. But first, the updates that have been pouring in. Apparently, 2 more tankers were targeted in the Strait of Hormuz recently. We're hearing reports about that after Iran fired drones and ballistic missiles earlier. Again, CENTCOM is not even admitting that any of this is happening, despite striking a tanker themselves earlier on in the week. They're just refusing to acknowledge what is going down because it appears that they have worse problems that they're having to deal with. And that is that the USS Abraham Lincoln is to be replaced. And the reason for that is because of the poor conditions on board for troops that have been deployed in the area. Not only are they facing the fact that they are fighting a war entirely for Israel's interests, but apparently around 5,000 of those sailors have faced a food shortage, amongst other deteriorating conditions on board the aircraft carrier. And the aircraft carrier itself has been deployed for over 9 months. That is not supposed to happen. But nonetheless, those service members have been subjected to that. That has caused, according to the reports that we have now, fights on board the aircraft carrier. Also, there are other reports that have come in, and of course, they've been covered in the corporate press today, and that is that service members have been having suicidal ideations, that they have been threatening to throw themselves off of the ship. We've even heard reports of deaths over a dispute on the ship as well. So we're really in uncharted territory here. Like, this is unprecedented. And the reason why they're doing this, of course, is because they're out of options. So what they want to do as a replacement strategy is that currently they're looking at deploying more aircraft carriers because they don't want to withdraw from the Persian Gulf area and they can't simply give up. So they are now, and they'll be inbound between 7 to 14 days. They'll reach the region. There's the 2 other aircraft carriers, the USS George Washington, which has been confirmed is passing into the region. So they're replacing their aircraft carrier. And they like to brag about the fact that they have 50,000 troops in the region. And we see that the US is also deploying more aircraft to the Persian Gulf region. We had images over the past few days, which you're seeing here on screen, satellite imagery. At first, there were 3 refueling aircraft that were spotted being repositioned back in Al Ubaid Air Base in Qatar after they were withdrawn last month due to Iran's ballistic missile and drone fire. And now there are 7 that have been placed back in this air base. And we are not seeing any signs that the US Trump administration are backing down. And this is despite the fact that report after report is emerging about how badly the US have been taking a beating because of this war. So another report that has just emerged is that the US military has lost 25% of its MQ-9 Reaper drones. Iran shot down or destroyed at least 45. That amounts to $1.3 billion lost in your taxpayer dollars if you're a citizen of the United States. And that's not the only loss as well that the US has suffered of its MQ-9s, because it actually lost around, I believe, 25 that were shot down by Yemen's Ansarallah as well. And they don't have the ability to replace these munitions in any sort of rate that is going to enable them to use them anytime soon. We're talking about the setbacks, the military setbacks of the United States here, that their standoff munitions stockpile is incredibly short. Around 80% of key air defense interceptor missiles have been either used or destroyed. And it could take them up to a decade to replace all that they've lost here. And they have gained absolutely nothing at all. And now we've got to the stage of this conflict where they're just keeping their troops in the region. And it doesn't appear that they even have enough food to supply their Navy officers and their service members aboard a key aircraft carrier. They're just sort of waiting around for 9 whole months, now suffering food shortages, just so that they can be there to guard the Israelis. And this is a big development, not just because it is a blow to the US and its power projection in the region and across the world, but because now they're not going to have the aircraft carriers, in reserve that they can use to place one in the Mediterranean to help out with the Israelis and Israeli air defense. And that is something that the Israelis, of course, are very concerned about. And the Israelis are not letting this go, because the Trump administration has one of two options. Either you sign an agreement, which is not going to be a victory agreement, that's for sure. You're going to have to give up more now if you want to get back another memorandum of understanding after they violated the past one. Or you go back to all-out war. And Israel has been pushing for that, because I'm sure everyone has heard about the CIA, operation that was carried out to transport Trump out of Turkey through an alternate flight path and route because of Israeli intelligence. And when I first heard of this story, I was almost sure, I was almost certain that the Israelis provided this information on an apparent plot to assassinate Trump. And, lo and behold, a few days later, and the CIA says it has low confidence that there was a plausible threat on the US president. But, Trump will try and turn this into a story that shows him as so brave. He says that he took the flight that was more dangerous, that there were apparently 2 options available to him. If anyone believes that nonsense, I guess it's good for them. But in the real world, of course, Trump is still listening to Israeli intelligence, which is very telling. That he listens to Israeli intelligence, he listens to the Mossad, he listens to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over his own intelligence agencies. And that is still happening despite what happened when he attacked Iran on February 28. And that tells you something, because some people argued that Trump, he was just duped by Netanyahu and by Israeli intelligence, and he believed them that if he attacked Iran, the Iranian government was going to fall very quickly, and that it was, a deck of cards. If you take out Ayatollah Khamenei, the entire regime collapses. And I don't think you can argue that point anymore. And the reason why you can't is because he's now seen with his very own eyes that Iran has not collapsed. actually the very opposite. Iran has a stronger position in the region. And I'm sure even if he's not aware of every single detail, he's aware of a lot of what's gone on. He saw the funeral for Ayatollah Khamenei, which is the largest funeral in recorded history that occurred. There's no way that it's simply a matter of him being duped, unless he, has issues, he's mentally deteriorated. But how could he and all the people around him be duped and then continue to get duped? Is that the argument that's being made here? Or do they have something on him, right? And he's following whatever he's told to do. And he's essentially acting as a puppet here. Because, and we showed this clip in one of the past streams, even his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, came out and publicly bragged and praised Trump for launching the so-called Operation Rough Riders against Yemen, which lasted about a month and a half and cost the US taxpayer billions. Again, another war that was entirely in Israel's interests. Hegseth said that Ansarallah, the Yemeni armed forces, or as he calls them, the Houthis, are not engaged in this regional war because of what Trump did. I mean, to say something like that indicates that you have no idea what you're doing whatsoever. That he's more interested in promo videos where he's, putting fake plates on a bench press and, advocating for giving steroids to people in the US military, as if that is something that is needed. Where on the ground, what's really happening is the UAE, again, this is the second time that they started flying in planes. This time we heard filled with gold bars to Tehran, apparently releasing some of their frozen assets, along with hundreds of millions of dollars this time. But last time, apparently, it was billions and that they released to them in cash payments that they took on these flights, just so that they don't get hit. But of course, that's not entirely been the case. The UAE has engaged in cover-ups of what has been happening, because last month we now have satellite imagery. The Iranians themselves have released some of this satellite images showing some of the targets that were hit more recently, and 3 of those have been focused on targets that were struck in the UAE. So you have, for example, the 57 TPS radar in an air base in the United Arab Emirates, and this was destroyed by an Iranian attack. So the satellite images are there depicting that. Of course, they've been enhanced to, show what's happened in these photos with AI. But there are other images that exist as well depicting this. Then we have here, this is an aluminum factory that was targeted. And we also have a gas compression facility, a refinery facility that was also targeted by the Iranians. That was revealed. Also, they released imagery depicting, and there were as well images that came out previously showing this attack specifically on a data center that was taken out in Bahrain. So Iran has received the money, but decided that it would, continue to publish information about the attacks that it did carry out in the territory of the United Arab Emirates. And while we're on that subject, something very interesting has been happening. We've covered some of these elements in previous streams, but I think it's relevant to go into all of these details. The first is that the operations against the forces, well, to set this up, let's take a look at a map here. The United States has a number of different ways to put pressure on Iran, and it has attempted to force different allies in the region to take action on its behalf. And very publicly, we've heard calls from the US president to achieve this. One of which has been an effort from very early on in the war to use Kurdish Iranian opposition groups in northern Iraq in order to target Iran and to perhaps cross over the border. The idea here was to use those militant groups and that they would later go all the way to Tehran eventually, and they would carve out territory within Iran, within Iran's territory, and form a breakaway Kurdish zone. But Iran has not been allowing that to happen. In fact, they've been doing cross-border operations, and they've been using, in order to carry out these operations, their special forces unit attached to their army, not the IRGC. In order to do this, they've done dozens of operations where they've crossed into Iraqi Kurdistan, and they've assassinated high-ranking officials within these Kurdish Iranian opposition groups that are backed by the United States. Now, this article here is actually from March, and there was some discussion in the Arabic media as well. There were reports that the Iranian elite units were preparing for covert operations, and that they would perhaps target US personnel directly. Now, we haven't seen that yet, but they have now launched these cross-border operations, which have been very publicly announced and have gone after US proxies in the region, which is very much important. So the Iraq front, which again is a very weak front, all you need to do is look at the topography, and it's very obvious why that's difficult for them to invade Iranian territory when these armed groups are nowhere near as powerful as the Iranian army and IRGC. Of course, there are the Basij paramilitary forces as well, which are a volunteer military organization loyal to the Islamic Republic, which are fighting on their behalf there and will guard Iranian territory. It's just not a smart idea. It hasn't been done historically that anyone has succeeded in invading and destroying Iran this way in any sort of fair fight. Even when there was the Mongolian invasion, that was through this corridor here in the northeast that they entered Iran historically. But with modern weapons and the forces that Iran has, a very bad idea, but it could cause problems. So of course they're eliminating a threat, and we've seen that Iran is not playing any games here. They continue, despite the fact that there's very little reporting on this, they continue to take out weapons depots. Here's some footage recently from about a day or so ago. Footage that was filmed near Erbil in northern Iraq of the results of Iranian drone and ballistic missile attacks, which continue to target these forces. The US has actually withdrawn a whole bunch of its assets from Iraqi Kurdistan because for them it's a liability. And very clearly, they're not able to defend against Iran's strikes. They're ongoing. And the United States CENTCOM or COPCOM doesn't even bother commenting on this. I guess because it's not US personnel directly, they're not going to talk about it. And then there's another issue which has popped up because there was a mobilization last month which was noted along the Iraqi border. And there were some indications and Iranian politicians talking. So, they weren't, the highest ranking officials, but former high ranking officials and politicians in the parliament that were talking about perhaps doing a ground invasion of Kuwait. Now, I don't think that there will be a ground invasion of Kuwait where Iran will try and take it over, like Saddam Hussein made the mistake of trying to do in the first Gulf War. But what could actually possibly occur here is that they may use special forces units, as they've done these cross-border operations in northern Iraq. They could use them to cross over into Kuwaiti territory if they do feel as if there is a significant threat coming from their territory. I don't think that that is out of the question. Meanwhile, Trump is telling us that the Strait of Hormuz is open, everything's going well. And that is not actually helping the price of oil too much. It continues to go up despite these claims, because each passing day that the Trump administration claims that the Strait of Hormuz is in fact open when it's very clearly not, this impacts the credibility of his statement. So it is very likely that we're on the verge of another escalation, even if it goes to sort of a tit for tat between Iran and the United States. We've heard that U.S. officials have informed the Israelis that they are looking to commit a large-scale attack on Iran. We constantly hear of them wanting to target Iranian civilian infrastructure. That's something that, of course, the neoconservatives are pushing for. Trump keeps backing down every time that we get close, but that's because he doesn't have any good options. And like we just looked at there, the options are becoming more and more limited because Iran is taking these cards off of the table. The idea of using Kurdish forces, for example, now that's going to be a lot tougher than it previously could have been. And I think everyone understands, they know the consequences of taking that route and attempting to perhaps go for an invasion of that kind. Also, something interesting happened, because here on the stream, we've been covering the fact that the Trump administration has time and time again been pressuring Abu Muhammad al-Julani, or Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of Syria, to invade Lebanese territory. And we've covered this. Let's pull this up again. It's always good to have that visual representation. We've covered the amassing of troops and military assets by the Syrian forces along the Lebanese border in the north, and then the northern Bekaa. And as we've covered here before, they would be tasked with going into the Bekaa, which is known as this sort of strategic heartland of Hezbollah, and going after their weapons. This is something that has caused Hezbollah to reevaluate its strategies and to prepare itself for a possible incursion of this sort. And of course, those forces are still there and could be used. But something very interesting happened, because today we got word from Iranian media that Syria was directly threatened. Iran communicated with Ankara and sent a message to Ahmed al-Shara that if he invades, like Trump is pushing him to do, if he invades Lebanese territory and opens up this, what will inevitably be a sectarian bloodbath, then hundreds of targets in Syria will be targeted, including the presidential palace. So that's what we've heard from Iranian media. And I'm inclined to believe that some sort of message like that was sent, not only because it made sense, and I anticipated that Iran perhaps would get involved if something of this sort happened before. The Iraqi factions have already threatened months back that if Syria dared to do something like this, they would actively cross the border into Syrian territory and they would fight on the side of Hezbollah. But now with this happening, over the past week, the news from Syria and these sort of threats and everything that we heard before, and the reports about mobilizations, all of that, and the language that we've heard from the Syrian leadership, it seems to have toned down a little bit. So even the anti-Hezbollah rhetoric seems to have toned down, at least for now. So those are the reports they're in. If this is true and Iran has directly threatened the Syrians, Syria has no strategic weapons. Israel destroyed all of them. Syria can't hit Iran. Syria can't do anything. Its air defenses are destroyed. It's handing over now. There's like this secret agreement that was signed and revealed that they're handing over remaining nuclear material to the IAEA and struck an agreement with the United States to do this. And that nuclear site, of course, the entrances and exits were bombed by the Israelis when Bashar al-Assad was overthrown. And then they just openly handing it over. So they have no strategic weapons, no air defenses, a piss-weak economy, and nothing but, fanatical sectarian fighters basically on their side. And they can't really do a lot, because if they want to send them also on top of attacking Lebanon to go and fight against the Iraqis, that's not going to be a very good day for them. So if Iran did, this is a massive checkmate to Abu Muhammad al-Julani, because if he thought that he was going to get away with this and that there wouldn't be a response, well, of course, he was wrong. And I don't think he wanted to do it personally. I'm not on the side of those who believe that he wanted to do something like that, because, he knows that there will be consequences. But now the Israelis are threatening Syria again. And I wonder why all those Israeli threats to attack Syria, and the Minister of Diaspora Affairs for the Israelis, fanatical psychopath, was talking about the inevitability today of war with Syria. And of course, it makes no sense, because the Syrian regime has not touched the Israelis. In fact, they've tried to disarm independent local factions and resistance factions that have popped up, that have fired on the Israelis or have weapons and could potentially threaten them. They've attempted actively to disarm them. They've engaged in direct dialogue with the Israelis. They signed a joint fusion mechanism with the Israelis, which de facto recognizes Israel and also sets forth a path for joint economic projects between Syria and the Israelis. They've done all of that, and Israel is still threatening them. And the reason why is pretty simple. The Israelis are not happy that the Syrians are a bit iffy about invading Lebanese territory. And of course they should be, because it could mean the end of this current rule in Syria if that happens. It's very easy to see that happen, because it only takes a few moves to throw the country into chaos, where all of these different competing groups, including factions that have now aligned themselves with what is the new Syrian Arab army, these guys are militia factions, realistically, and they're still ideologically committed. So for them, very quickly, if the state takes a turn in a direction they don't like, or there's an opportunity to go a different way, that could open up new wounds. We already saw that there were clashes that had taken place in northeastern Syria between formerly the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led militant groups that were formerly backed and trained and armed by the United States in northeastern Syria. That was taking place earlier this week. And that occurred because factions loyal to Damascus opened fire on Kurdish families, around 400 Kurdish families attempting to return back to their homes in the north. So at any moment, things could escalate, including surrounding the issues that still are happening between the Druze in Sweda and the authorities in Damascus, and Arab tribal forces there as well. Israel, meanwhile, is still building, outposts and bases inside of Syria. Settlers keep coming across the Golan into the area that Israel has illegally occupied in Syria, which, by the way, the territory that Israel has occupied in Syria since the fall of Bashar al-Assad is actually larger than the entirety of the Gaza Strip. So this is how much land, and nothing, of course, Julani has never threatened to attack the Israelis. His Nusra Front used to get support from the Israelis. Their fighters were treated in Israeli field hospitals in the Golan Heights. And the Israeli media, according to them, they actually helped treat Jolani's sister once, according to a report that they released recently. So that's something to keep in mind. But of course, this is only one of those fronts. Iran has the ability to, like we showed a video at the end of the last stream, of a Syrian group calling itself the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria, which has popped up along the Syrian-Israeli disputed line in southern Syria, based out of Daraa. And these fighters, of course, are evidently aligned with Iran and the overarching axis of resistance. There's also other groups that popped up, and they were firing rockets and drones at the Israelis during the 40-day war period that were factions, clearly Alawi factions inside of Syria that were owing their allegiance to Iran as well. So Iran does have still influence in Syria. It's not fully diminished, albeit they sort of, withdrew a lot and they didn't try to stick around as much as they could have. But for now, funneling those weapons to Hezbollah is the most important thing, and it's easy to pay people off. Quite frankly, much easier to pay people off in Syria to smuggle weapons now than it was under Bashar al-Assad. It's just there's so much more corruption now, which, the big thing was the corruption of the former leadership, but it's a different kind of corruption. It's more localized corruption that you can get around, these barriers of trying to stop weapon shipments. Another thing that is very interesting is that, before we get into the Yemen front, is that there have been repeated attacks on Libya's largest oil refinery in Zawiya, and there were a number of drone attacks committed against this refinery. Now, initially, it was, of course, we didn't know what caused the explosion. Now we know it's been confirmed that drones were launched multiple times, that precision drones were used in order to attack these sites. Now, if we put this together with the attack that also occurred around a week ago on two tankers were affected, but one of them was a tanker which acts as oil storage, petroleum storage for the United States in Egypt. If you look at those two there, both of them struck with drones, both of these attacks benefit Iran more than they do the United States. I know that Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, indicated after there were accusations, that Ansarallah may have been involved in this. Yemen's armed forces may have been involved in this. And I thought to myself, this is very far away for Yemen to hit, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to do this. But what could be happening here, this is very possible, is that there could be cells that have been set up, or there could be even independent groups that are backed and trained and perhaps, weapons components smuggled to them that are operating out of North Africa and are capable of carrying out these sort of attacks, which of course work to the benefit of Iran and to the detriment of the Europeans and the United States, which are suffering from these attacks, quite frankly. We've not seen, when we hear about false flag attacks, it's always possible that the Israelis could be involved in something like this, but it doesn't really necessarily benefit them. So knowing that Iran is actually acting proactively now, there could be a case made to say that this sort of action could serve as a warning to the United States and its allies, that if they don't back off, they don't end the war, that things could in fact get a lot worse for them, and the hand of the axis of resistance could reach beyond what we previously thought. With that being said, Yemen has now established a scenario, and I just want to say this before we look at all of the footage and the satellite imagery depicting what's been happening in some of the maps. The scenario that has now been set up in the equation drawn by Yemen's Ansarallah-led government is that not only will they strike Saudi Arabia, the mainland, if they are struck, right? Not only will they hit Riyadh for Saudi strikes on the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, they will hit Saudi oil facilities simply because Saudi Arabia violates their airspace and flies drones into their airspace. And on a number of occasions, they'll shoot those drones down, then they'll hit the Saudi mainland. That is an insane equation. And Saudi Arabia has not been able to properly respond to this. What they've been doing is they've been trying to use their proxy forces inside of Yemen to carry out strikes on their behalf. They're transporting in more equipment. But this is a terrible scenario, not just for Saudi Arabia, but also for the United States, because Yemen has effectively stopped the export of 6 million barrels of Saudi oil per day. They have locked down Bab el-Mandeb, right here, the strait, and they have done it very aggressively, more aggressively actually than Iran has. Now we have the Strait of Hormuz closed, the Bab el-Mandeb closed to the Saudis, and it's not out of the question that it could be very easy, by the way, because the Saudis right now are still able to transit the Red Sea and go up through the Suez Canal. There is at least claims that they are doing this to some extent. Now, even if they do that, that can be locked down, because all it takes, as we've seen historically, to close the Suez Canal is just one ship has to get lodged in a certain point in the Suez Canal. It's not very wide, and then it is shut down, and that causes a ripple effect around the globe, and it halts traffic through the trade route. So to choke off the Suez Canal is not something that is actually all that difficult. All you have to do is, hypothetically speaking, is sink a ship in the Suez Canal, or take it out, at least temporarily. It's going to be, you've got to make sure a ship is wedged in there, and then you've taken out that trade route. This is a major catastrophe for the United States. Not only are oil facilities suddenly, blowing up, no one's taking accountability for any of this. In Libya, in Egypt, these are hits to Europe, hits especially Zawiya refinery in Libya getting repeatedly shut down. This is a hit to Europe. This is a hit to the United States. And we've already seen that the Kurdish option is basically being taken off of the table of the United States by the Iranians. They're doing cross-border operations with their special forces units. They, of course, have amassed forces along their border there. They've made, according to Iranian media today, direct threats against the Syrians if they seek to go into Lebanon. And so the whole idea of causing a civil war in Lebanon and then having the Syrians invade to go after Hezbollah, that it is not panning out the way that they want it to. And if they push for it, it could be a disaster. They could end up losing control over Syria if they do that. So this is really a checkmate moment for them. And what's happening, of course, in Yemen is making things 10 times worse. So this is what I mean when they're more aggressive. Ansarallah, when they're targeting ships, this one near Bab el-Mandeb, when they're targeting these ships, they're killing people when they're targeting these ships. They're doing it very aggressively. They're not just trying to, send a message and make, damage it. They're trying to put it out of service. They're acting in a much more aggressive way than what we're seeing in most cases with Iran. Also, we're getting round-the-clock attacks on facilities, on airstrips, on bases belonging to Saudi's proxy forces inside of Yemen. This is Mukha port in Yemen that has been repeatedly struck, and a warehouse has been completely destroyed, a line associated with the forces that are, of course, on the side of Saudi Arabia. And we're also seeing that they're striking other targets, like in Marib. Here, some footage that was released during a drone attack was taking place. And earlier today, they targeted the Jazan oil refinery. These facilities, what you're seeing here is earlier attack, the result of an earlier attack, but Ansarallah attacked yet again today. And that was another retaliation for simply Saudi violating Yemeni airspace. So they don't even need to launch an attack, a direct bombing attack on Yemen anymore. Ansarallah are preempting that, and they're getting out ahead of it, and they're openly just targeting Saudi Arabia. From north to south, by the way, they will hit anything, and they're going after their oil and gas facilities. What we've also been seeing is that, so this is also from Marib. Marib, there is the threat of a massive ground offensive. We're also seeing Ansarallah move forward and push forward in the area. But what you're seeing here are forces affiliated with the Saudi-backed opposition in Yemen open fire on drones incoming from Ansarallah as they're heading towards their military positions. This footage here is only from a few hours ago that this emerged. So massive developments there. Again, constant missile and drone fire. They targeted a airstrip that was originally built by UAE-backed forces in Yemen earlier today, which allegedly hosts helicopters and drones, because there were a number of drone strikes that occurred against forces which are affiliated with Ansarullah's government in Yemen. And it appears that they have retaliated almost immediately to those attacks. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is flooding in more reinforcements. They're flooding in military vehicles so that their forces, their proxy forces, can use them. We've seen footage of this emerging today. So it looks like they're gearing up for a major battle, but the conspiracy that was set by the Saudis, most likely it will come out that it's not just the Saudis, but the United States and the Israelis perhaps were involved in this as well, coordinating this. But they sought to do an offensive, and they had plans to attack Ansarallah and to seize more territory inside of Yemen. That appears to have been preempted. And there's no time better than now for Yemen to seek to take back its territory. It's in a very strong position. So here's some on the map here. So you see down south, there's Bab el-Mandeb there, and that port that we just saw images from that has been repeatedly struck. Some of the satellite images show some of that damage is the Mukha port in the south there. And also then there's the confrontation lines. And here's a map sort of depicting this in Marib. And if the Yemeni armed forces loyal to the Ansarallah government in Sana'a managed to capture Marib, this is a major stronghold for that Saudi-backed opposition there. So this is one step closer for them to taking the whole country, because this will cut them off. Like Saudi Arabia, its ability to arm its proxies and its influence as well in Yemen will severely diminish if they take Marib. So this is, taking it is quite important, and also opens the way for them to get access to their oil and gas resources inside of the country too. Taking the south is another question entirely, but taking Marib was so important to the Yemeni armed forces that back in 2021, when they launched an offensive to try and seize it, they had to sacrifice tens of thousands of fighters. And it ended up being that they failed to complete the capture of Marib. Instead, what happened is they began clashing with Saudi Arabia directly, firing missiles into strategic targets, and the UN came in and brokered a ceasefire agreement, which held until last month, when Ansarallah declared that it was over, that they're tired of Saudi's blockade on their country, and that they would impose a counter blockade on Saudi Arabia, and that they would punish Saudi Arabia for interfering in their country as well. So this offensive is very, very important. And again, the reason why this is so key, and why they oftentimes they lie to you, or they just don't cover Yemen at all, is because if you knew what this outcome in Yemen would actually mean for the region, then people would be more up in arms about what is going on and what has been done to the people of Yemen. They don't want you to know anything about that. That's why since 2015, nothing has been said. In fact, a few months after Saudi launched its offensive against Yemen in 2015, they get a high position at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and they got voted into it, right? That's the so-called international community that we're talking about, that recognizes the so-called internationally recognized government in Yemen. If you have been following these live streams, and I've spoken about this a number of times, the internationally recognized government of Yemen is just a joke, a complete and utter joke. It was the Yemeni Presidential Leadership Council, which was created in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Saudi Arabia, and its so-called president, which is just the leader of this council created by the Saudis, right? The so-called president, the leader of that council, Rashad al-Alami, lives in Saudi Arabia, right? And this whole process of the so-called internationally recognized government, just to cover this once again because it's important. So Yemen had a revolution in 2011. By 2012, there was an agreement which was struck. Now, this agreement was for Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the dictator of Yemen for 33 years until he signed on to this agreement to give over power in Yemen. The agreement was brokered by the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it was signed and it was put together in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So the idea was he hands over power, and then there is an election. And just so everyone is aware, this election meant that out of the election process, the second in charge at the time, Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi, would be up for election, right? That he would take over the country. And on the ballot, on the ballot was only Hadi in this election. Okay, that's what came out of this GCC handover of power that occurred. So Hadi, who was already in a position of power, was then put in control. He was the only person, the only candidate on the ballot. And it was 60-something% of, in terms of a voter turnout at the time that voted. And of course, he got the vote. Many, of course, boycotted the vote altogether. But, President Hadi then was in power. He was supposed to be in power for a 2-year transitional period. If you fast forward, then Ansarallah, which was part of the revolution, not the Houthi rebels, because they're not now a bunch of rebels, they run a government, okay? But Ansarallah had participated in this revolution. The history of their movement goes back to like the 1990s. You could argue goes back much further with Zaidi, the Zaidis are a group that are almost solely exist inside of Yemen. They're technically Shia. They're very different from the Shia of Iran, Iraq, and of Lebanon, but they are technically Shia. And there was a revivalist movement which was started by Hussein al-Houthi, right, who's the brother of the current leader of Ansarallah. His name is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. So Hussein al-Houthi, who was a scholar, sort of spearheaded this revivalist movement inside of Yemen in the 90s. He, got elected to, and went and ran in politics. He was involved in the political process. But his movement was very critical of Saudi Arabia and Saudi's influence on Yemen and influence through pushing Wahhabi, Salafi doctrine on the population of Yemen. He didn't like this. He was very critical of this, very critical of the West, very much opposed to the West. By the early 2000s, what had happened is Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had sort of had a rough patch with the United States because of him siding with Saddam Hussein previously, he flipped. And he was fully on the side of the United States during the so-called War on Terror. And so in 2004, he sought to go out and arrest Hussein al-Houthi, who was the head of this revivalist Zaidi movement in northern Yemen. And this caused, armed clashes that went on for many years between the government forces and what would later become the Ansarallah that we know today. And of course, that family or that tribe is called the Houthis, right? That's where the name comes from. And back then, you could call them rebels. Like, that makes sense to call them rebels. But you couldn't say that they were an Iranian proxy because they were most certainly not an Iranian proxy. In fact, Hussein al-Houthi was very critical of Iran, both in terms of religiously and some of its political decisions as well. And this is all on record. It's all well documented. Okay. But of course, Ali Abdullah Saleh, having resulted in this raid in 2004 and the clashes, resulted in the death of Hussein al-Houthi. And there was massive tensions between the government forces and, this revivalist movement, right? And militants. You go to 2011, what happened is these Gulf states were scared to their bones of the Arab Spring because they didn't want anything to happen. It was fine for them if it happens in Egypt and Tunisia and, something happens in Syria, they can fund, groups to take over and try and wrestle control of those countries. It's great for them if that happens, but not in Saudi Arabia, not in the United Arab Emirates, right? They crack down hard on anyone that decided to try and revolt, right? And it's harder. Like in Saudi Arabia, there's a big threat. But in the UAE, I think there's a lot less of a threat for there being some sort of revolution there. But that being said, they do not have an interest in allowing this to happen. When they saw it was happening in Yemen, instantly they had to resolve the issue. But they resolved the issue in a way of installing another puppet. And so people were very critical of Hadi. Many were critical of this entire process that came out of the post-2012 scenario. And eventually there was a coup. And it wasn't like it was just Ansarallah that forced Hadi to resign. Hadi, then the former president of Yemen, fled to Aden, and then later he went to Saudi Arabia, of course. But it wasn't like it was just them that was behind this, because they actually sided with the party in order to run the government initially, and they dissolved the parliament, and they set up a committee, a revolutionary committee to run the country. They sided with Ali Abdullah Saleh's party, and 2/3 of the Yemeni armed forces sided with them. It was the breakaway faction that sided with Hadi. And really, it wasn't Hadi that was running the show. It's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia put together the coalition to invade Yemen and to attack Ansarallah. They thought it would just take months. They put together and backed their proxy forces and groups and all sorts, tribes, anyone that they could go to and bribe or, have beef with, Ansarallah for whatever reason. It's not just simple to explain it as one side or another. There are many different actors inside of Yemen. But then we have, and by the way, Ali Abdullah Saleh had this split with Ansarallah in 2017. He's now gone, right? He's dead. He is not in the picture. But that being said, now Ansarallah has a government. It runs the government. It has other parties there. It has a prime minister. It has a president. It has a minister of defense. There is a parliament there. There's, they have their armed forces. And then Ansarallah as a party has its own spiritual leader, which is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. Okay. On the other side, in 2022, they dissolved the powers of the president Hadi, okay, who ran an election where it was literally just one man, okay, who ran in the election. All of this is important because when people say to you about the internationally recognized government versus the Houthi rebels, so that you actually have that context and understand what is being said to you and these lies that are being repeated. And it doesn't mean that you have to support Ansarallah, but it just means that you should probably have this context so you can make up your mind about what is actually going on there, right? So 2022, they dissolve his powers. They set up the Yemeni Presidential Council, whatever. And then they've got the head of that. And it's all set up in Saudi Arabia out of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. In 2019, they had to do a power sharing agreement between the Emirati factions in Aden because, of course, they have to operate things and do their alternate governance in what we could call South Yemen, in historic South Yemen. So there was a power sharing agreement between the Southern Transitional Council, which were UAE proxies, and the Saudi proxies. And then at the start of this year, the UAE got way too confident and tried to buy out a load of people and take over the south of Yemen, which when we're talking about South Yemen in a historic context, that includes the whole east of the country, because the east of the country is not really inhabited by that many people. It's more like that western strip of the country where it's heavily, there's people, the majority of the population there. So with the situation there now, the internationally recognized government is who? There's even the elected president before ran in an election that was set up by an agreement that was put together by the Gulf states in Saudi Arabia, where he's the only guy in the election. And the election was yes or no. It wasn't Hadi or someone else. Yes or no? And then when he relinquishes his powers to a body set up in Saudi Arabia. By the way, the ceasefire between the two sides was a ceasefire between who? A ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Yemen being the Ansarallah government in Sana'a. If this was an independent movement, why did the internationally recognized government just do nothing since 2022 until now? Until it's told to put out statements and act and puff its chest out and all of this nonsense. It was there to be the negotiators, because all it is a bunch of Saudi proxies that they, in order to solve the issue in Yemen, they would need to do some sort of unity agreement with Ansarallah, because this involves, tribal politics, all sorts of factions, different figures who people are loyal to, all of this, right? So it needs to be solved. But Saudi Arabia is one side and Yemen's the other side. That's the ceasefire in reality. And when it deteriorates between the two sides and suddenly the internationally recognized government's forces are fighting with Ansarallah again and are making statements, and we're hearing all the media, and nobody has an interest in telling you the truth about this, even in the Arab world, because the Arab world's media, it's controlled by all of these states that have an interest against Yemen. And most of the world is not going to side with Yemen because there's no reason for it to. They'd rather side with the Gulf states, economic opportunities, oil and gas, right? They're not going to want to go against Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait and Bahrain and Oman in favor of Ansarallah in Yemen. They're not going to do that. That's why you don't hear anything about it. You don't know anything about what's going on, the politics there in Yemen. And it's a very crucial region because, again, if it is free, and by free, I mean it's controlled by a local Yemeni governance, it's governed by the Yemeni people, right? It's and it is independent, then you now have the only Arab country that has a government that is not only pro-Palestine and anti-US imperialism, but also is actively going to fight for Palestine and oppose the Greater Israel Project and propose to send its troops all the way into Iraq, that wanted and proposed, before the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, proposed to send its forces to the Golan Heights to fight against Israel. That is not the sort of Arab power that the United States or the Israelis want. That's why the Israelis have been involved in training forces to fight in Yemen, mercenaries to fight in Yemen against Ansarallah. That's why the Israelis have been involved in there in a number of schemes and plots. They've carried out assassinations. They've helped with logistics, all sorts, right? And they have been behind the Saudi-led coalition's campaign against Ansarallah this entire time. And what shocked them is that Ansarallah developed weapons that were sophisticated enough to strike them during their genocide on Gaza, and drones. And they hit Tel Aviv with these drones and missiles. The only country, the only government on earth that issued the order during the Gaza genocide on behalf of the Palestinians to open fire on Tel Aviv was the Yemeni government led by Ansarallah. That is a fact. There's no way of getting around that. That's a fact. No other government did it. No one else put an embargo on the Israel. No one else locked down waterways and bankrupted the Israeli-controlled port of Eilat, or Rash, which is the name of the city, the Palestinian name of the city. Okay? No one else did that. None. None of those Arab countries are independent. None of those Arab countries acted or did anything. Forget Arab countries, the Muslim world. The only ones that did anything, Iran in the end defended itself, and Iran supplied and helped, of course, in a number of ways, the Palestinian resistance, but Iran didn't directly fire on Israel because of Gaza. That's not the reason why it fired. Yemen did that. Okay, then you have armed groups like Hezbollah and the Iraqi factions that open fire, right? But right now, these strategies that are being hatched, it gets even deeper than that because, of course, Yemen, if Yemen is united, Yemen gets access to its oil resources and is in this fight, and it will become like another Iran in a way, except an Arab, more radical in my opinion than them too. And it will serve as an example, by the way, to the Arab world that you can overthrow your government and you can have a revolutionary movement that does not bow to the West. It's possible. It will serve as an example. And that scares the shit out of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, even the current regimes in Egypt and elsewhere, of course. So they don't like that at all. That's why they're all opposed to it. They don't want independence. Look, they want countries like Syria, right? A complete failure of a state that has access to its oil and gas resources now and has the sanctions lifted and is still dysfunctional as hell, right? And it's just controlled by the United States. The United States controls Damascus. Like, that's the truth. Sorry to break it to you if there's anyone listening that thinks otherwise, but that's the truth. The United States controls Abu Muhammad al-Julani, or now I have a theory why he changed his name from that, to Ahmed Shara, publicly, his public persona, because you can't call yourself Julani, which literally means like from the Julan, right? The Golan Heights, if you were literally just given up on it, right? Despite a few statements here, the Julan, blah, blah, blah. It's like Trump was speaking in front of you about it, right? The only time that Syria's current administration will condemn like any statements about the Golan Heights is like when Colombia's new corrupt right-wing government that just loves Israel, and it has an earthquake, and its first response to an earthquake is, let's do a bunch of recognition of random stuff that pertains to Israel that has nothing to do with our people, right? Let's recognize the Golan Heights, right? And Syria will stand up and go, how dare you, Colombia? Because it doesn't mean anything. That's why. But Trump can sit there in front of Ahmed Shara and literally tell him to his face, we recognize the Golan Heights, and we did that. No one ever did it before, and it was so amazing. And he can do that whole thing in front of him, and he just sits there and goes, oh, okay, yeah, cool. Boss said he gave away the Golan Heights. Right? But with that being said, these developments are not the only thing that is worrying the Israelis. Now, the Israelis, of course, have major plans and for territorial domination, and this is what it's sort of limited back to. They want the United States to go into an all-out war with Iran to weaken Iran's infrastructure, to weaken Iran economically. That's part of its conspiracy, that it wants to force the United States into a scenario where it does that. However, it's not being very successful at much that it's doing, and instead, what it's doing is focusing on territory which it currently has some control or sway over. So in the Gaza Strip, they're very adamant on the fact that they are going to continue to control the territory in Gaza. They will not allow anything to mess that up. In the West Bank as well, they're actively encouraging an explosion in the West Bank. Now, what they are hoping will happen is that it will be dysfunctional and that the Palestinians will be not united when this happens. So when there is eventually some sort of revolt that happens in the occupied West Bank, then all of these communities and cities are going to be so isolated, there's no unifying force behind them, and that they can start to drive people out of their homes. And they've already started driving people out of their homes in different areas of the West Bank, right? So we just landed on a random area, right, near Jericho or Ariha. There's all of these Bedouin communities, for instance, in the Jordan Valley area. And, they've sought to expel many of them. They've expelled over like 60 different communities since October 7. They're establishing a new settlement in Jenin. They've completely ethnically cleansed the Jenin refugee camp, Nur al-Shams refugee camp here in Tulkarem. They destroyed it. They ethnically cleansed, the population. Tens of thousands of people have been expelled. Probably never even heard much about it because there's just no reports about it. And they're constantly putting pressure. Like recently, there has been a lot of raids and arrest campaigns in Qalandia. They've been injuring a lot of people. They've occupied a lot of people's homes as well in the area. They've been torturing different people. In Al-Khalil, they've been putting up, or Hebron, which is their name for it, that they've been putting on a lot of pressure in that area. You have Masafa Riyata, which is a collection of communities. Of course, they continue to harass the people there and push them out of their lands. But the real problem that they're going to face here, and this is something that the Israeli think tanks keep talking about, is that things could actually go south in the West Bank real quickly. And the one way that the situation there could be dramatically transformed is if those groups manage to get their hands on FPV drones. Because they've seen what they've done in southern Lebanon. And in the West Bank, if they learn how to use FPV drones, not that difficult, and they get their hands on them, it's going to be difficult to track them down, the people who are operating them. If they can hide themselves effectively, and they can operate these drones, then this is going to be an enormous problem. The reason why it's such a problem, and it's a bigger problem in the West Bank than it is than if the Palestinian resistance in Gaza has FPV drones, or even if Lebanon has FPV drones, is because in the West Bank, there are settlements littered throughout the territory. And FPV drones means you can be like 10 miles away or whatever, and you can fire this drone off and you can hit an Israeli settlement. And you can take out guards that are manning checkpoints, right? There's a lot that can be done with these drones. There's infinite targets. And there's also military bases and closed military zones, some of which are actually used for military, maneuvers, that can be struck with these drones. They're very open, right? They're very, very open. So this is a nightmare scenario for the Israelis if Palestinian resistance factions manage to get their hands on FPV drones in any kind of numbers and they start operating them. This is something they fear greatly. And I can guarantee you this is something that if Iran is working on anything in the West Bank, then they're working on this. That is for sure, 100%. I don't have any doubt about that. And there are fears that things are heating up too much in the West Bank because the Israelis are putting all this economic pressure on the Palestinian Authority. So many people have been pushed out of their jobs. They can't access their lands anymore in many cases. They're being pushed out of their villages. They're being squeezed. Inflation has gone up. Lots of people there in the West Bank are trapped by these loans that they'll never pay off, that they can take from banks there, which are just insane, the access that they'll give people there. But again, it's to trap you in a cycle. In the cities, like in Ramallah, people will take out these massive loans from banks, right? To live a lifestyle that's unaffordable, and they give it, and they want to trap people there, right? With these loans and credit cards and everything that they give. And so with the economy tanking, partly in large part because Israel is not releasing tax funds to the Palestinian Authority, which means that they can't pay their people properly, right? And it's very corrupt, which means they're going to prioritize some over others. So the situation there, and I could go into many different factors that have created this sort of division and destroyed, the West Bank. But the situation there is deteriorating, and the Israelis are actually concerned because although they want to engineer a situation which will allow them to ethnically cleanse people en masse from the West Bank, it could go wrong very quickly. very, very, very quickly. The West Bank, unfortunately, has not been like the hotbed of resistance historically, other than a few key areas. Like, for example, like Jenin, historically speaking, like with the resistance that groups that were created by Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was a Syrian sheikh who came to Palestine, and basically there were workers in Haifa, and he ended up putting up his final stand in Jenin, and he created a resistance which was sort of based around Jenin. Like there are certain hotbeds for it inside of the West Bank, but historically speaking, the resistance has come from like the diaspora. Even the resistance now, if you look in the West Bank, like Jenin refugee camp, Tulkaram's Nur al-Shams refugee camp, right? Like all of these, if you see the resistance has all been like even recently in the refugee camps. In Gaza, like 80% of the people in Gaza were all refugees. So like, again, like in the Fidayeen and, you know, these resistance fighters that they had historically, like Gaza was always like a hotbed of like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Marxist resistance group. And it has a very long history, but it's like the refugees are like the leaders historically, right? Whether that be out of Jordan that they had their resistance, or out of Beirut that they had their resistance. Some resistance groups, you know, operated in and based themselves out of Damascus. But it was like from the outside. But what we've seen in the West Bank that works the best, and why it makes Israel so vulnerable, is because now, you know, although, you know, the economic ties aren't like it was during what was called the First Intifada in 1987, when the Palestinians rose up, also started out of Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, by the way, by refugees. But that being said, what happened then, you know, it put much more economic pressure on them. But now they just have so many settlements, so many settlers. Like these settlements, for the Israelis, in the way that the Israelis see it, is that to them, there is no like this line that you're seeing here, which is where, you know, the apartheid walls and fences are built and stuff. They don't see it like that. This is just all Israel for them, right? Like when they go to the Golan Heights, that's just Israel. This area you can't go because there's terrorists and extreme. This is the way they view it, by the way. This is the way they view everything. Oh yeah, we would like to go into Lebanon, but the terrorism and blah, 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 right? And in the West Bank, it's just like, oh, well, it's Israel and Israeli areas, but there are terrorists here and there and like all over the place. So we can't go to like Ramallah, right? And their ugly ass way that they say everything, right? And like, you know, like you've got, let's zoom into the way that they think, right? You got like situations where there's like here, like this is Bil'in, and then there's Modalin Ilit, right? Which is like, you know, they Hebrewized the area and they took a part of this village here, Bil'in. So there's like an apartheid wall here, right? And set up that sort of protects them here. And it sort of backs onto here. So for them, like this is just Israel and they don't think about it, right? And there's just terrorists behind a wall. Right. Actually, most of these people in here aren't like the Ben Gvir types who live in this settlement. They're like these more, they're just like ultra Orthodox, I think, just religious types that don't do a whole lot. And they just, you know, if you go near there, then you can hear like them reciting their Hebrew stuff, prayers or whatever. I'm not an expert on Judaism. But yeah, and then there's others that are like actually smack bang in the middle of the West Bank. Those ones are really exposed. But for them, again, it's just normal. Like that's just how it all is. Like there's nothing out of the normal. And their explanation for why you can't go, you know, like 5 kilometers out this way or that way in your so-called homeland is terrorists. Get out of jail free card and everything. Terrorists and anti-Semites are everywhere around you, and that's why you can't go anywhere. But they're gonna have a massive problem, because if these people rise up, even like they were to just decide to rise up together, very difficult to happen for a number of reasons. Perhaps I'll get into that in another stream. But if they were to rise up together, this would create a huge problem for them. But if there's armed resistance in the West Bank, proper widespread armed resistance where the settlements are getting attacked and stuff, and they have FPV drones on top of that, oof, that's going to be a difficult situation for them. Difficult situation for them. So yeah, they have that. They want to stay in South Lebanon. They keep trying to press forward into the Ali Tahir Hills area. They want to go deeper. They've set up a military base in Khiyam now, this area here. Actually in the same area where there was the Khiyam like detention center where they used to take people in South Lebanon and torture them before Hezbollah liberated the south of the country in the year 2000. Yeah, so they don't want to withdraw. They're talking about going to war with Syria and all of this stuff. But easily this can fall apart. And it can fall apart very, very quickly. So like their strategy is a very, very desperate one. Very desperate. In terms of what will actually happen in the West Bank, I can't really predict exactly how that is going to go. The West Bank is quite unpredictable. It could explode tomorrow, or nothing could happen for 10 years. You never know with the West Bank. It's a very complex scenario and it's hard to predict. But with that being said, Iran has put the United States in a chokehold in a major way. And there's not really any way that they can get out of it, quite frankly. Because if the United States was actually, if the Trump administration was sovereign and had control over its own government, let's just imagine, then it would sign some sort of an agreement with the Iranians and decide to pull out of the region. But Israel doesn't want that, right? And the Israel lobby controls him. So it's just like, okay, like how do I go in between? How do I manipulate the market? How do I delay and delay and delay and delay? Some have said that, he wants to delay this until the midterms. I'm not sure whether that argument holds up or not, to be honest with you. It's very possible that could be the case. But yeah, they're in a bad position all around. I cannot see any way out. And it looks like it's heading towards escalation. So I would anticipate that this is going to have to escalate dramatically. And very soon we're going to see all these fronts ignite. I mean, Yemen is already on fire. But again, nobody even pays attention to Yemen, unfortunately. And even what I've explained here, and I've tried to explain and outline in other episodes of our stream, some of the very basic facts about Yemen, like not going into any detail really, but these basic facts are just so foreign to everyone, even though the US, the UK, the EU, the Israelis, all those Gulf states, which are allies of the collective West, have been involved in this war in Yemen, which has killed around 400,000 people. They've been involved in it since the start, since 2015. This is like 11 years they've been involved in this war. And yet we know nothing about it. Same way we know nothing about in the West, they'll never tell you anything about like Muslims or the region, like the Middle East and what the different ethnicities or even Christians live there, basic things. Like, and then that's why they can get away with lying to you about everything, right? Even with Lebanon, you see these stupid people who are like, just pro-Israel paid stooges, and these idiots get up on podcasts and all of this, what they call themselves alternative media backed by billionaires, right? So it's just because they changed from like a more professional studio and had a suit on, and now they have like, a t-shirt and a microphone, like it's still mainstream media, realistically speaking, right? Just the format changed. But that being said, these people get on there and they're like, Lebanon used to be a Christian country, and then all the Muslims drove out all the Christians, and the civil war was about Muslims versus Christians. And it's like, no, no, it wasn't. But nobody knows anything about Lebanon. And again, like when your military is sent over there to fight and die for Israel, and you're telling them that they're fighting for their freedom, you never tell them anything about that country. Nothing. Or maybe there are different languages that are spoken in the region and different ethnicities, and Iranians, like Persians are not the same as like Arabs, and Afghans are different, and they don't know. They don't know, and they're not going to tell you. And then that's why now they're pushing all of this nonsense about hate the Muslims. You need to hate the Muslims. Remember 9/11? It's like, it's not landing the way it used to, right? And there are more people now, and there's more alternative media, and we're going to scream at the top of our lungs to make sure that everyone actually knows what's going on. So even if you're not somebody that's convinced by those rather ridiculous arguments, you're now armed by alternative media with the tools you need to debunk these morons, quite frankly, right? And their Zionist propaganda, the members of the $7,000 club. So if you do think that alternative media is valuable, just to end this off now, do hit that like button. Please do comment, let us know your thoughts. Share this video. We're getting killed on the algorithm right now. So please do, make sure if you're watching this and you do like it, do hit that like button, do add a comment, let us know your thoughts. And if you want to help this show keep going, if you want to keep it alive, we're looking for those 300 new members. And a big thank you to all of the members that have joined already. You can join us on Patreon, or you can join our YouTube membership, and that will help us keep going. We're going to continue to cover everything. Again, we're going to give you all the context. We're going to bring you the latest analysis, all of those satellite images that are coming out, the videos from the resistance groups, every single angle we're going to try and cover and touch on to make sure that everyone is up to date with everything that's going on. With that being said, we'll be back on Monday, same time, same place, and we'll be bringing you the latest. It does look like anything could happen at any time. So we are, of course, going to be on top of that. If you want to continue to follow that, there's our X account and our Telegram, where we will have the latest live updates. So, if you want to get more news than just through these streams, then to see what's going on, you can follow us there. Till next time, thank you to everyone for watching today, as always, and we will be back on Monday, 4 p.m. CST, and we'll see you there.